The agreement, including the release of the dozens of hostages being held right now by Hamas. The Biden administration says there are 7 American hostages still in Gaza. At least 3 of them are believed to be alive.
There is a section of Israeli society that's against it. They don't want to see Palestinian prisoners released. They say they're terrorists, that even if it means not returning the hostages, not returning the bodies of those who've been killed, that the war should continue.
There has allegedly been a major breakthrough in regard to a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Now, they've allegedly reached the ceasefire deal, though, as of this morning, several details, including the actual start date of said ceasefire, remained unclear. And to be sure, there are still some obstacles in the way when it comes to ratifying and really making this ceasefire final. And I want to get into the details of that because I think it's just as important as the breakthroughs that are being largely reported across most mainstream media outlets. They're kind of reporting on this as if it's already a done deal. At this moment, as I speak to you, as this video gets recorded, that ceasefire deal has not been officially confirmed. So I just want to, move forward with an abundance of caution. But with that in mind, according to the New York Times, the ceasefire is set to take effect immediately, according to a White House official. The first phase is to last 6 weeks, during which hostages will start being released. Now, it was not clear what day that begins. And part of the reason why it's not clear is because, again, at this moment, there is no confirmation that they have accepted the ceasefire officially, that the Israeli cabinet has ratified the ceasefire. So a lot needs to happen before this is finalized. But President Joe Biden, who really wants the ceasefire to be part of his legacy, has already done a press conference making it appear as though this is set in stone. And I think that's a big mistake. But nonetheless, here's President Joe Biden explaining more details about the deal.
The deal is structured in 3 phases. Phase 1 will last 6 weeks. It includes a full and complete ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli forces from all the populated areas of Gaza, and the release of a number of hostages held by Hamas, including women and elderly and the wounded. And I'm proud to say Americans will be part of that hostage release in phase 1 as well. And the Vice President and I cannot wait to welcome them home. In exchange, Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. And during phase 1, the Palestinians can also return to their neighborhoods in all the areas of Gaza. And the surge of humanitarian assistance into Gaza will begin. And the innocent people can have a greater access to these vital supplies.
I want to be honest with how I feel about what we just heard. I think that sounds way too good to be true. And I am deeply skeptical. And I am hoping that I'm proven wrong. But the idea that the Israeli government is going to sign on to the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip, and the idea that Palestinians will be able to return to all parts of the Gaza Strip, including the north, just seems inconceivable to me. But again, I could be wrong. Now, as we know, and as we've done extensive reporting on, the Israelis had already basically cut the Gaza Strip in half, and they considered the northern half of the Gaza Strip to be a buffer zone. So I don't see how all of a sudden they're going to sign on to a deal where the Israelis withdraw from the Gaza Strip and allow Palestinians to go back to the north. But let me give you the other details of the ceasefire deal. Phase 2, because Biden did just speak about phase 1, which would last 6 weeks. Now, after those 6 weeks, phase 2 would essentially involve a permanent end to the war, a permanent ceasefire. And negotiations would be taking place in regard to the permanent end of the war during the first 6 weeks. Now, Biden claims that if those negotiations in terms of a permanent end to the war take longer than 6 weeks, well, the halt in fighting would still be in place as long as negotiations for a permanent ceasefire are still happening. And also in phase 2, Israeli soldiers would again allegedly withdraw from Gaza, and all remaining living hostages, and these are the men who are still alive, will be returned to Israel. And in phase 3, the remains of the hostages who have died while in captivity would be returned to their families, and reconstruction of the Gaza Strip would begin. Now, this is the deal that President Joe Biden had presented to the Israelis and to Hamas in the spring of last year. It is unclear why suddenly Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government would accept this deal. I should also note that incoming Trump administration officials have been involved in these negotiations as well. Donald Trump has issued all sorts of threats specifically against Hamas and the Gaza Strip if they fail to return the hostages. But it appears, it is my read, that Donald Trump has made some promises to Benjamin Netanyahu. We don't know exactly what those promises are. And I think that that is what has encouraged Netanyahu to potentially go along with this ceasefire deal. Okay. Now, Biden doesn't want to give Donald Trump any credit for this. Trump wants to take all credit for this. I'm not really interested in, the narcissism of our politicians. I would like a ceasefire deal to happen, but I also think that it's wrong to say that Trump wasn't involved in any of this when we know that some of his incoming officials were also involved in the ceasefire negotiations. Now, the negotiations were brokered by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt. And a Hamas official by the name of Bassem Naim confirmed to NBC News and the New York Times that the militant group has in fact agreed to the ceasefire deal. He says, "We are very happy to reach a deal today to stop the aggression against our people, but unfortunately, we were able to reach the same deal last May." He's alluding to the fact that this is the same deal that Biden had presented to the Israelis and to us last spring. And why did we wait so long to finally, accept this? If in fact it is confirmed as the ceasefire deal that Israel will accept. And I want to be clear, from what I've seen, all of the obstacles in place that could potentially dismantle this ceasefire deal are on the Israeli side. Okay, so before anyone gets too excited, you should know that these obstacles exist and they could play a role in basically ending the possibility of this particular ceasefire deal. The deal needs to be ratified by the Israeli cabinet. And as the New York Times reported, some hardline members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government have voiced opposition to the deal. This has happened before. In fact, every time we think there's going to be a ceasefire deal accepted by the Israelis, they tend to renege. And it's because there are some extremists within the Israeli government, within the Israeli cabinet, who refuse to accept any ceasefire deal. And they brag about serving as obstacles to an end to this war. Officials are also saying that there are some technical details that need to be worked out. And two officials who spoke to the New York Times said that there was a last minute issue, get a load of this, over the Egypt and Gaza border, which previously Egypt and Gaza had control of, but during this war, Israel took control of that border. Egypt has a huge problem with that. And having control of that border has essentially hindered or prevented humanitarian aid from coming into the Gaza Strip. It has also prevented people who have been civilians, children who have been severely injured as a result of this war from being able to leave in order to get much needed medical care and attention. Also, while the reality of where the Israeli government is on this ceasefire is something that anyone paying attention can make note of, they're actually telling American journalists like Jeremy Diamond something entirely different. Remember, Hamas has accepted the deal. Israel is saying, there's some technical issues and we have some problems about who's going to control the border between Egypt and Gaza. So it's all them right now. They're the ones who have potential issues with this deal. Hamas has accepted it, but that is not what they're telling Jeremy Diamond over at CNN. Take a look.
I think it's important to note that for the last 2 days, the Israeli government officials who I've been speaking with have been saying this is in Hamas's hands. We need Hamas to say yes in order to get to a deal. And that is indeed what has now happened. And so for all intents and purposes, we do indeed now have an agreement between these parties to go into a ceasefire that is expected to last 6 weeks, during which you will see 33 Israeli hostages released, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails in exchange the much needed entry of humanitarian aid.
Again, just want to reiterate, the Israeli cabinet, as we speak at this very moment, has not ratified the ceasefire deal. And by the way, as part of the ceasefire deal, remember, the Israelis would have to release Palestinian prisoners. And the Supreme Court in Israel has to provide a 24-hour time period for the family members of the hostages or the family members of individuals who have been impacted by those Palestinian prisoners to essentially appeal that portion of the ceasefire. So this is not set in stone. I want to be clear about that. And part of the main reason why it's not set in stone, the main reason why this isn't something that we can, green light and say is definitely going to happen, is because there are Israelis who have problems with it, both in the government and potentially within the civilian population, if they choose to fight this in the Israeli Supreme Court. And also, let's not be naive and forget about people like Israel's national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who the Jerusalem Post recently reported on with this headline. Get a load of this. Ben-Gvir boasts of blocking Gaza hostage deal time and time again. Quote, in the past year, through our political power, we succeeded in preventing this deal from moving forward time and time again, Ben-Gvir noted. So he bragged on X that his party in particular had prevented a hostage deal on numerous occasions. And the office of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, said in a statement that a number of clauses in the ceasefire agreement remained unresolved, but that it was hoped that these would be sewn up later tonight. So there is a possibility that later today, if you're in the United States, based on our time zone, later today we'll get word that it was ratified by Israel's cabinet, but that hasn't happened quite yet. But look, there is also some hope. So I want to be fair and note where I see glimmers of hope in this story, because as of this morning, Ben-Gvir also wrote on X that the United Right Party has since joined the government, who now supports the deal. So his party, the MKs, no longer hold the balance of power. They have less leverage when it comes to standing in the way of the passage of a ceasefire deal. So that's good news. And Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar says that he believes that the Israeli government does in fact have the majority necessary to ratify the ceasefire deal. But again, just going back to the press conference involving Joe Biden, it just seems way too good to be true that all Israeli forces will be withdrawn from Gaza and that Palestinians who were forced out of the northern half will now be allowed to go back to the north. And I want to be clear, there's nothing left in the north. Every single building, every single structure in the Gaza Strip has either been completely leveled or so severely damaged that it's useless. And so they want to go back to the north. The Palestinians who are from the north want to go back there, but they also acknowledge that there's nothing to go back to. And that was very much by design. That was what the Israeli military intended to do. They wanted to make it uninhabitable so Palestinians had nothing to return back to. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm very, very curious to see how this develops. Also worth noting that, the highest figures within Hamas have not come out publicly saying that they are going to endorse this agreement or that they accept the agreement. I mentioned one Hamas militant or official who spoke to both NBC News and the New York Times and said, no, we are accepting the ceasefire deal. But again, in order to implement the deal, Hamas's negotiating team at the talks in Doha, Qatar must obtain the consent of the group's commanders in Gaza, including Mohammed Sinwar, whose brother Yahya led the group before being killed by Israel in October. Now, again, assuming that the Israeli cabinet ratifies the ceasefire deal and assuming that any challenges to the deal in the Supreme Court in Israel don't stand in the way of the passage of the ceasefire deal, Israel's Supreme Court, again, would have about 24 hours to permit an appeal. So the earliest a ceasefire could go into effect would be Friday, and then the first group of hostages would come out Sunday. Now, in regard to Americans who are among the hostages, there are reportedly 7 American hostages. In the first phase of the ceasefire deal, should it actually happen, 2 of them are expected to be released, again, in the first phase. And then the third, which I'm assuming is a male, would be released in the second phase if it gets to that. And I'm hoping that it does. I really want peace. I really want the end of the bombardments. While this ceasefire deal hasn't officially been accepted, it hasn't been officially ratified by the Israeli government. Make no mistake, the Israeli Defense Forces have continued their aerial bombardment of the Gaza Strip. And so again, we'll see how it plays out. I'm really, really hoping for good news. It is freezing in Gaza right now. People are dying from hypothermia. Obviously, people had been dying from starvation, thirst. Clean drinking water is difficult to come by. And of course, that doesn't even include those who continue to die as a result of the bombings and the aerial bombardments. So again, really crossing my fingers. I'm hoping that I'm proven wrong. But as it stands right now, I do see many obstacles in the way of this ceasefire actually happening. So we'll wait and see what happens. I hope I can come back and report some good news to you all.
If you enjoyed this video, that's because of our members. They make us independent, they make us strong, and they make us honest. Become a member today by hitting the join button below.